The following is adapted from my opening statement in my debate with Pearl Davis. A lot of people in the so-called red pill community claim that marriage is a bad deal for men. They use false statistics and fallacious arguments to get men to reject marriage. But in today's episode, I'm going to show what's wrong with their case. And usually it boils down to one of the following fallacies or errors in reasoning. First, there's the wrong target fallacy. This happens when a critic focuses on a bad thing related to marriage, but concludes that this proves only marriage is bad. For example, anti-marriage advocates often talk about how marriage is a bad deal because men are sometimes mistreated in child custody cases. But that's not unique to marriage. If you cohabit or even just hook up with a woman, you can still father a child and deal with custody issues. However, marriage makes a man the presumed father of the child, with natural rights that unmarried men don't have, even though unmarried fathers can still be liable to pay child support. The children of unmarried men are 10 times more likely to be aborted, and if the child does survive the pregnancy, he's 3 to 6 times more likely to live in poverty. Another wrong target is women themselves. Marriage skeptics often say that marriage is a bad deal for men because modern women are worse than previous generations of women. These critics say that there just aren't any women worth marrying. But once again, this argument says nothing about the goodness or badness of marriage. For many red pillars, women are good enough for hookups that can result in child custody issues, or cohabiting relationships that superficially feel like marriage but are far more likely to fail. But for some reason, women aren't good enough for marriage, which, as we'll see, benefits men far more than hookups or cohabiting. Also, if there aren't any good women, that means there aren't any good men either, because men can't meet these red pill standards as well. Modern men are just as promiscuous and even more overweight than modern women. A 2019 Experian study found that men carry more credit, auto, and mortgage debt than women. Millennial and Gen Z men have weaker grip strength, and they make less money than older men did at their age. These critics have not shown women aren't good enough for men. Instead, the data shows men and women are both in bad shape compared to older generations. But there's hope. Marriage is the best way for men and women to mature together and bring out the best in one another. Number 2, red pillars often rely on the anecdote fallacy. But one sad story about a marriage doesn't show marriage itself as bad, because for every sad story, there are statistically 2 to 3 stories of happy marriages. And there are many stories about sad, sick, lonely men who never marry. Even marriage skeptics in academia will only argue that, at best, marriage doesn't increase happiness. But even they agree that men who marry are better off concerning health, wealth, and happiness than men who never marry. Number 3, there's the comparison fallacy. For example, Pearl Davis says just as you wouldn't fly on a plane that has a 5% chance of crashing, you shouldn't get married, even if it has similar low odds of divorcing.
Even if it's 5% of men that this happens to, let's say out of 100, this happens to 5%, even in the Christian churches. You know, I would never, if I got on a plane and there was, there was a 20% chance of I get to paradise and there was a 5% chance of it crashing, I'm not getting on.
But you can't focus on the worst outcomes of one choice while ignoring the worst outcomes of the only other choice. That's the comparison fallacy. It's like someone who thinks driving is safer than flying because he only reads a bunch of stories about plane crashes and never thinks about car crashes. Of course, flying is far safer than driving, and marriage is less risky than non-marriage. You can't compare the best outcomes of non-marriage to the worst outcomes of marriage. You have to compare the typical outcomes in each case, be it flying and driving or marriage and non-marriage. And anti-marriage advocates exaggerate the harms of marriage.
You know, about half of marriages end in divorce.
The average marriage is 7 years.
According to the National Center for Family and Marriage Research, the median length of all marriages is not 7 to 8 years, which is the length of marriages that end in divorce, not all marriages. The median for all marriages is 21 years. And the divorce rate is closer to 35%, not 50%. 50% was a future projection from the 80s that has since been falsified. In fact, we're now seeing the lowest divorce rates since 1970, about 14 divorces per 1,000 married women. For weekly churchgoers, the divorce rate is half the average rate.
90% of child support payments go from men to women. 97% of alimony payments go from men to women.
We know that about 90% of alimony is paid from men to women. So
Also, just because 35% of marriages end in divorce, that doesn't mean you have a 1 in 3 chance of absolute misery. Divorce sucks, but people typically survive it intact. In fact, men do better than women after divorce. Men's income increases by 20%, while women are twice as likely to fall into poverty. Alimony is only paid out in less than 10% of divorces, and according to the U.S. Census, the average child support payment is $441 a month, of which only 60% usually ends up getting paid. Saying marriage is an arrangement where women are paid to leave only reveals a person's ignorance of child and maternal poverty.
It's not fair that women get custody 90% of the time. It's not fair that men are always paying alimony, they're always paying child support, and that they are punished for being traditional.
Go sit in on divorce proceedings. Sit in on custody dispute proceedings. And then think again whether you want to get married.
Women do not get child custody 90% of the time. 95% of custody cases are mutually agreed upon outside of the courtroom. Women get full custody 40% of the time, men get full custody 20% of the time, and shared custody makes up the remaining 40%. Women usually get full custody because men don't ask for it. In a Massachusetts study of 24,000 divorces, only 8% of men sought custody, and 94% of those men got full or partial custody. Finally, a 2006 study in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health showed that while divorced men were 27% more likely to die prematurely, 58% of never married men were more likely to die early. Never married men risk growing older and having few or no social connections. Yes, there are stories of messy divorces, but my wife, who is a registered nurse, could tell you horror stories of men dying alone in the hospital, spending every day by themselves staring at the same blotch on the ceiling because they had no one to come and visit them. Now, some men desire marriage and are unable to find a wife. Then that's tragic. But rejecting marriage out of fear is like the person who refuses to go to the hospital because he worries about medical errors but doesn't think about people dying at home from easily treatable illnesses. This does not mean every married man will be happy or that every man who doesn't marry will be miserable. We're talking about the average results of both groups, and on average, married men fare better.
And you have to understand, this is death to a lot of men.
65% of divorced men get remarried. 93% of men say they would marry their spouse again if they could do marriage over. If anti-marriage advocates are right that marriage is a death sentence for men, then why do most men voluntarily go back to death row after they're released, divorced? The answer is that these men correctly identify what red pillars fail to grasp. Marriage isn't bad for men. In fact, marriage is good for men. It's no wonder God told Adam in the book of Genesis, it's not good for the man to be alone. So he made Eve to remedy this problem. To make it clear, it is a lie that half of all marriages end in divorce. The truth is that most marriages last a lifetime, and 80 to 90% of them identify as happy. A Gallup survey conducted between 2008 and 2020 of 800,000 adults showed that married people rate their well-being 12 to 17 points higher than unmarried people. The General Social Survey from the University of Chicago also shows that married men are twice as likely to rate their lives as very happy when compared to non-married men. Married men also make 10 to 20% more money per hour, and they have more sex than never married men. Studies also show that even men who end up divorced live longer, are economically better off, and are just as or even happier than men who never marry. Now, marriage skeptics might say these studies only prove that happier, richer men get married and unhappy poor men do not get married. But when you look at the typical married man, he is not a 6'2" rich Chad. More importantly, if a man chooses to marry, then he needs to become marriageable. This involves developing positive traits that make him desirable to women, and at the same time improve his own self-esteem and happiness. But I'm not arguing that marriage makes men happy. I'm arguing against the red pill claim that marriage is a bad deal for men, or that it's likely to make men unhappy. That's simply not true. In fact, marriage is the best way for men not just to hang on to happiness, but to increase it. The Harvard study of adult development, which tracked people for 80 years, said good relationships were the #1 predictor of happiness, and it showed that men who married ended up happier and lived 7 to 17 years longer than men who never married. When I was unmarried, like many unmarried men, I was content thinking that 2 folding chairs and a TV on the ground were sufficient living room furniture. But after you get married, your wife helps you see how much better life can be. You have a desire to provide the best life you can for your wife and children. And you have someone in your corner to root for you even when things get tough. A 2013 Harvard study showed that married men are less likely to get cancer and are even more likely to survive cancer. Never married men, however, are more likely to not build up for their futures. This leads to a greater chance of living in poverty and suffering from premature deaths from suicide, drug overdoses, or just unhealthy lifestyles. To summarize, pointing out flaws in women doesn't prove marriage is bad, because men have those same flaws, and marriage is the best way to grow out of your flaws. Telling a sad story about a married man doesn't prove marriage is bad for all men. And looking only at the risks of marriage doesn't prove marriage is bad, because you have to compare those risks, especially low-risk marriages, to the greater risks of not marrying. And if you do choose to have sex, you face far worse risks than married men do. I'm not saying every man needs to get married. My boss likes to say, man was meant to live in the context of a vow. Maybe you're called to the priesthood, religious life, or you can just make a private vow to use your life to serve other people, like Batman. But we call those things sacrifices because they all involve giving up the great good of marriage. If you're a man considering marriage, carefully discern if you should marry the woman you love. But don't give in to some kind of hopeless fear. As a man, you were not made to live in fear. You were made to cross oceans in small wooden ships. You were made to stare down an invading army and fight until the last man standing. You were made for greatness. You weren't made for sitting around all day watching cynical YouTube videos and complaining about women. God invented marriage, and he gave it to the human race so you would be fruitful and multiply. And Jesus Christ raised marriage to a sacrament. And the data is clear from hundreds of thousands of men that marriage is the primary engine that helps them live a long, healthy, and happy life. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you'd like to learn more, check out Brian Wilcox's book, Get Married, and my debate with Pearl Davis on Pints with Aquinas. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more great content.